David, an elderly man in his 70s, lived alone in a quiet town. His days passed in solitude, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional chirping of birds outside his window to keep him company. He had once had a family, but time had taken them away. His wife had passed many years ago, and his children had moved far away, caught up in their own lives. The walls of his small house held countless memories, but none that spoke back to him in the silence of his lonely existence. One crisp autumn morning, as David took his routine walk through the park, he heard faint whimpering coming from a nearby trash bin. Curious, he moved closer and peered inside, only to find a small, shivering puppy with matted fur and pleading eyes. The little creature looked up at him, its body trembling from cold and fear. David hesitated for a moment. He had never imagined taking in a pet at this stage of his life, but something about the helpless creature tugged at his heart. Carefully, he picked up the puppy, cradling it in his arms as he walked back home. After giving the pup a warm bath, David wrapped him in an old towel and placed him by the fireplace. He fetched some leftover bread and milk from the kitchen, watching as the tiny dog eagerly ate, its tail wagging for the first time. Seeing the pup's joy sparked something inside David, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. That night, as David sat in his armchair reading a book, the little pup curled up at his feet. He looked down at the dog and said, "I suppose I should give you a name. How about Buddy?" The puppy barked softly in response, as if accepting the name. From that moment on, Buddy became more than just a stray David had rescued. He became his family. David took care of Buddy like a father caring for a child. He ensured Buddy received his vaccinations, fed him nutritious meals, and gave him daily baths. Their days were filled with companionship, long walks in the park, playing fetch in the backyard, and sharing meals together. The loneliness that once weighed heavily on David's shoulders started to lift. He found himself smiling more, laughing at Buddy's antics, and even talking to him as if he understood every word. The townspeople soon took notice of the pair. The old man who once walked the streets alone now had a loyal companion by his side. They saw a renewed spark in David's eyes, a happiness that had been absent for years. Buddy, in turn, thrived under David's care, growing into a healthy, strong dog with an unwavering devotion to his owner. Life had taken an unexpected turn for David. He had found joy in the most unexpected place, a little abandoned puppy in the trash. But fate had more in store for them, and their journey was only just beginning. One fateful morning, Buddy eagerly bounded into David's room, ready to play as he did every day. But something was different this time. David wasn't sitting in his usual chair, sipping his morning tea. Instead, he lay motionless on the floor, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Buddy barked, nudging David's hand, but there was no response. Panic surged through the loyal dog as he frantically paced around the room. He knew something was terribly wrong, but he didn't know how to help. Desperate, Buddy ran to the front door, scratching at it wildly. He whined, jumped, and barked with all his might. His sharp, persistent cries echoed through the quiet street outside, drawing the attention of a pair of police officers patrolling nearby. They stopped in their tracks, watching the frantic dog. "What's wrong, boy?" one of the officers asked as he cautiously approached. Buddy darted back toward the house, then turned to look at them, barking again as if urging them to follow. The officers exchanged glances before nodding in understanding. They hurried after the distressed dog, entering the house to find David lying unconscious on the floor. One officer immediately called for an ambulance while the other checked for signs of life. "He's still breathing, but we need to move fast." The ambulance arrived within minutes, and paramedics carefully lifted David onto a stretcher. Buddy tried to jump up, wanting to stay by his side, but the medics gently held him back. "Sorry, boy. You'll have to stay here for now," one of them said, patting Buddy's head. As they closed the ambulance doors, Buddy barked desperately, his heart aching as he watched the vehicle speed away. For the first time since finding his home with David, Buddy was alone again. Hours turned into days, and Buddy refused to eat. He sat by the door, waiting for David to return. The lively, playful dog had turned into a sorrowful, silent shadow of himself. He had no way of understanding what had happened, or whether his beloved human would ever come back. One day, determined to find David, Buddy slipped through the partially open gate and followed the scent he had memorized so well. He weaved through streets, dodged cars, and eventually reached the hospital. But no matter how hard he searched, he couldn't find David. The scent was there, but the man he loved was nowhere in sight. Buddy returned home, his tail drooping, his heart heavy. He curled up on David's chair, inhaling the familiar scent, and closed his eyes, waiting, hoping. Days turned into weeks, and Buddy's loneliness only deepened. He spent most of his time by the door, ears perked up at every sound, hoping it would be David returning. But the house remained empty. Buddy barely touched his food, and the once lively home felt lifeless without his friend. One evening, as Buddy roamed the streets searching for David's scent, he spotted a familiar face, the police officer who had helped take David to the hospital. Buddy's tail wagged slightly before he ran toward the officer, barking loudly. The officer, recognizing Buddy, crouched down and patted his head. "Hey, little guy, you still waiting for your friend?" Buddy barked again, then turned and started running, looking back to make sure the officer followed. Intrigued, the officer decided to follow him, curious about what the dog wanted to show him. They arrived at David's house, and Buddy ran straight inside, heading to the old man's empty chair. He looked at the officer with pleading eyes, as if begging for answers. The officer sighed, realizing just how much Buddy missed David. "All right, let's go see him," he said, standing up. Buddy's ears perked up, and he immediately followed as the officer led the way to the hospital. As they arrived at the hospital, Buddy eagerly dashed through the doors, sniffing the air for any trace of David. The officer led Buddy toward the reception area, where he inquired about David's condition. A nurse, recognizing Buddy from David's stories, smiled softly and gestured toward a room down the hall. Buddy rushed toward the room, his nails clicking against the tile floor. But just as he reached the doorway, a security guard stepped in front of him. "No pets allowed," he said firmly. The officer tried to explain, but the hospital policy was clear. As Buddy whimpered in protest, a soft voice called from inside the room. "Let him in." Days passed, and Buddy remained outside the hospital, refusing to leave. Each morning, he would find a way to sneak in, trying to locate David. The security guards had grown familiar with him, and, though they tried to keep him out, they couldn't help but admire his loyalty. One bright morning, Buddy reached the usual window, but David's bed was empty. Panic set in. Had something happened? Had David left him forever? Frantically, Buddy ran from window to window, his heart pounding. Then, a familiar scent filled the air. He turned toward the hospital garden and saw him, David, sitting in a wheelchair, a nurse helping him stand. With a burst of energy, Buddy bolted toward him, barking joyfully. David turned at the sound, his tired eyes lighting up. "Buddy!" Buddy leaped onto his lap, licking his face, his tail wagging furiously. David chuckled, tears welling in his eyes. "You never gave up on me, did you?" The nurse smiled. "He's been waiting for you every day." David wrapped his arms around Buddy, feeling the warmth of his loyal friend. He had fought to recover, and now he had a reason to keep going. Together, they would return home and continue the beautiful journey they had started. Buddy barked happily, as if agreeing. He had finally found his way back to David, and nothing would ever keep them apart again.